Today we're diving into some pretty intriguing philosophy. We're going to be tackling David Hume, specifically his thoughts on causation. And we've got Helen Beebe's book, Hume on Causation, to guide us.
Hume's perspective on causation is it's definitely fascinating. It's also a real challenge to some traditional ways of thinking. He really pushes back against the idea that we can just reason our way into understanding cause and effect.
Yeah, you're definitely right about that. So to kind of set the stage a little bit, could you give us a quick overview of the dominant philosophical view that Hume was responding to?
Sure. So for centuries, the prevailing thought, especially in this thing called the image of God doctrine, was that human reason, like, perfectly mirrored divine reason. So basically, we were believed to have this innate understanding of how the world works, including causation, just because we could think.
Oh, okay. So it's like saying we're kind of born with a blueprint of the universe in our heads, and by just thinking about it, we can unlock the secrets of cause and effect.
Yeah, that's a pretty good way to put it. But Hume, well, he saw things a bit differently. He was more into the science of man idea, a more empirical approach. He wanted to investigate how our minds actually work, based on experience, on observation.
Right, right. So that sounds a lot more grounded, a lot less mystical. Can you talk a little bit more about how this science of man perspective, how does that actually play into Hume's understanding of causation?
Absolutely. So Hume had these three main concerns when it came to causation. First, there was the genetic aspect.
Yeah.
Where do our ideas about cause and effect even come from in the first place? Then there's the epistemological side. How certain can we actually be about these cause and effect relationships? And finally, the semantic concern, which is like, what do we even mean when we say cause? What are we really talking about?
So he's really kind of breaking it down, looking at it from all these different angles. But for our deep dive today, we're mainly focusing on that first one, the genetic aspect, right?
Exactly. We're going to explore how Hume explains the origins of our ideas about causation and how that really challenges the traditional view of innate knowledge.
Okay, so Hume's rejecting the idea that we're just born understanding causation. So where does he think these ideas come from?
Well, he argues against the whole idea of a priori causal reasoning. He says we can't just know beforehand that something we haven't experienced will behave the same way as something we have. This ties into what's called the uniformity principle, which basically says the future will resemble the past. But Hume says, hold on, this principle itself is based on experience, not pure logic.
Oh, okay. So we can't just assume that because the sun has risen every day, it'll rise tomorrow. We need experience to back that up.
Precisely. We don't actually see the connection between cause and effect. We infer it from what we experience. And that's where his famous quote comes in. All events seem entirely loose and separate.
Yeah, that's a pretty powerful image. It does challenge our intuition that there's some sort of inherent connection there. So if it's not innate knowledge driving our understanding, then what is it, according to Hume?
Okay, so Hume proposes this thing he calls the associative mechanism. He's suggesting that our minds, they connect ideas based on constant conjunction and habit. Like when we see a specific cause followed by a specific effect over and over again, our minds, they naturally associate the two.
Okay, so the more we see a pattern, the more our minds kind of solidify that connection, even if we're not consciously thinking about it.
Exactly. And this mechanism, it's not just a human thing. Animals, they learn, they anticipate things based on their repeated experiences too,
Yeah.
which suggests it's something deeper than just abstract reasoning.
Right, right. That makes sense. Is there anything that influences how strongly we make these associations?
Yeah, Hume really highlights the importance of vividness. Like direct experiences, what he calls impressions, those have a bigger impact on us than just thinking about something. The more vivid the experience, the stronger the association.
So if I just read about a fire burning, the connection between fire and pain wouldn't be as strong as if I actually, burn myself.
Exactly. That direct experience, it creates a much stronger association. And it really reinforces the idea that experience is key to forming these causal connections. And this leads us to another really crucial aspect of Hume's theory, his two definitions of causation.
Two definitions. Oh, now that's interesting. I'm all ears. Tell me more about these two definitions.
Okay, so the first definition is rooted in the constant conjunction of events in the world. It's like the observable regularity that we see. But the second definition, this one focuses on the feeling of connection that we experience in our minds. It's the subjective experience of expecting an effect after we observe a cause, a feeling that's driven by habit, by repetition.
So one is external, like what we see happening out in the world,
Yeah.
and the other is internal, how our minds are perceiving and interpreting those events.
And Beebee, she makes this really important point that these definitions, they're not about defining the true nature of causation itself. They're about understanding how we as humans, how we make causal judgments. It's about revealing our internal mechanisms for making sense of the world.
Oh, that's a very interesting distinction.
Yeah.
So where does this leave us in terms of understanding what causation is, objectively speaking?
Well, this is where Hume's ideas take a really radical turn. He challenges the very notion that there's some observable, mind-independent, necessary connection between events. He suggests that this necessary connection, it isn't something out there in the world, but rather something we impose on it.
Wait, so he's saying this necessary connection, this isn't some inherent property of the universe, but something our minds create. But wouldn't that undermine the whole concept of cause and effect?
Yeah. It's definitely a challenging concept to grasp. To help understand Hume's position, think about his analogy with aesthetic judgments. Like, think about beauty. Hume argues that beauty isn't some objective quality of an object. It comes from our feelings, our perceptions.
Ah, I see. So just as beauty is in the eye of the beholder, causation is in the mind of the observer.
Precisely. And this brings us to the concept of projectivism, which is really crucial for interpreting Hume's philosophy.
Projectivism. So it sounds like we're literally projecting something onto the world. Is about what Hume's getting at?
Yeah, in a way, the projectivist interpretation of Hume says that we don't directly perceive these necessary connections.
Hmm.
We project our feelings of expectation, of inference onto the world. And that projection, that creates the idea of causation in our minds.
So it's not that causation is meaningless or totally random. It's that we're actively participating in constructing our understanding of it.
Our causal beliefs, even if they're based on this projection, they're still grounded in our experiences. They reflect real patterns, real regularities that we observe in the world.
It's like saying a map isn't the territory itself, but it can still be a really valuable tool for navigating that territory.
Yeah.
It helps us make sense of this complex landscape, even if it's a simplified representation.
That's a fantastic analogy. Our concept of causation is kind of like a mental map that we use to navigate the complex world of events and how they relate to each other. It may not be a perfect representation of reality, but it's a tool that's proven to be pretty essential for our survival and for understanding how things work.
Yeah, this idea of a mental map is a really powerful way to think about Hume's ideas. How does he explain why we're so prone to projecting this idea of necessary connection onto the world? What's the underlying mechanism driving this projection?
Hume attributes it to the very nature of the human mind, specifically our instinct to form habits. As we repeatedly observe a certain cause followed by a particular effect, our minds, they naturally create this strong association between them.
It's like walking the same path every day. Eventually, you don't even have to think about where you're going. Your feet just automatically follow that familiar route.
Our minds are wired to look for patterns and to create these shortcuts. This habit-forming tendency, it's incredibly useful for navigating the world efficiently. We don't have to constantly reevaluate every single situation from scratch.
But couldn't this tendency to form habits, couldn't that also lead us to make mistakes? What if the observed connection between events, what if it's just a coincidence, not a real causal relationship?
That's a great point. And Hume recognizes that our causal judgments, they can be fallible, especially when they're based on limited experience. He acknowledges the possibility of accidental regularities that can sometimes mislead us.
So how do we differentiate between a genuine causal connection and just a mere coincidence? How do we refine our mental maps, so to speak, to avoid those potential pitfalls?
That's where careful observation, scientific methodology, and critical thinking come into play. Hume really emphasizes the importance of examining our beliefs, looking for counterexamples, and testing our assumptions against more evidence.
So it's not about just blindly following our habits, but using reason to actually assess how valid they are.
We need to constantly update and refine our mental maps as we gather more information and experience.
This reminds me of something we touched on earlier, this distinction between what Hume calls vulgar and sophisticated causal reasoning. Could you unpack that a little bit more for us?
Sure, so Hume distinguishes between these two levels of causal reasoning. Vulgar reasoning, it relies on immediate, uncritical associations based on everyday experience. It's that kind of intuitive understanding that helps us get through routine situations. But sophisticated reasoning, That goes beyond those surface level connections. It involves actively investigating, trying to uncover hidden causes, and critically evaluating the evidence we have.
So Vulcan reasoning is like going with your gut, while sophisticated reasoning is more um, like engaging in scientific inquiry.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Hume sees the scientific method as this refined form of causal reasoning. Scientists, they don't just accept those observed regularities at face value.
Yeah.
They design experiments, they control variables. They're really trying to uncover the underlying mechanisms that govern those cause and effect relationships.
So it sounds like Hume, even with his skepticism about necessary connection, he still recognizes the value and the power of scientific inquiry.
He views science as a way to improve our understanding of causal relationships, to make those mental maps more accurate, more reliable.
This has been incredibly insightful. It really seems like Hume's views on causation, while definitely challenging those traditional assumptions, they offer a really profound, really nuanced understanding of how we make sense of the world around us. But before we go any further, let's take a moment to let all of this sink in.
Yeah, I agree. This is a good point to pause and reflect on the profound implications of what we've been discussing. We've laid the groundwork for a deeper understanding of Hume's philosophy, which we'll continue to explore in the next part of our deep dive. Welcome back. So last time, we really got into how Hume's idea of causation is so different from that traditional image of God view. You know, the one that says we're born with this understanding. But he says, no, it's something we actually develop through experience and through our, mental habits.
Yeah, it's really pretty revolutionary, this idea that we're kind of projecting our own idea of causation onto the world. It really makes you rethink, like, the whole foundation of how we understand reality.
It does. It really challenges us to think about, okay, what do we really mean when we talk about causation? You know, maybe it's not about searching for some hidden force out there that connects events. Maybe it's more about how our minds kind of construct this idea of necessary connection, based on what we see happening regularly and our natural tendency to form habits.
So even though we can't, like, directly perceive this necessary connection thing, Hume's not saying that the idea itself is unimportant, right?
No, not at all. He actually recognizes how important this idea of necessary connection is in our lives. You know, it gives us a framework for understanding the world, predicting things, engaging in scientific inquiry. It's really fundamental to how we reason about the world.
So it's kind of like a mental framework that helps us organize our experiences and make decisions, even if it is, at the end of the day, like a projection of our own minds.
Right. It's a tool that helps us navigate this world that at its core might be much more loosely connected than we tend to assume.
That brings up an interesting question, though. If causation is ultimately a projection, does that mean it's less significant? Does it invalidate, like, scientific discoveries and stuff?
That's a big question, and there's a lot of debate around it. Some people argue that, his skepticism about this necessary connection leads to a kind of causal skepticism, which would really call into question the whole validity of science. But, others, especially those who support that projectivist interpretation we talked about, they argue that no, Hume isn't denying that causation is real or that it's important. So Hume, he really dismantles this thing that Beebee calls the insight ideal, this idea that humans are we come pre-programmed with this perfect blueprint of how the world works, kind of like a God's eye view.
Yeah.
And that lets us just deduce causes and effects through reason alone.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But he pushes back against that. He says, no, our understanding of causation, actually, it all comes from observation and habit. It's repeated experiences that form the basis of our understanding.
This is fascinating because he even uses, like, the analogy of animal learning to make his point. He says, like, our causal reasoning is basically like a dog learning to associate the sight of its leash with going for a walk.
Yeah.
So it's not about some, like, grand philosophical deduction. It's just learned association.
It's a really good analogy. Hume calls this custom or habit.
Okay.
And Beebee, she really stresses this as one of the central pillars of his whole thesis.
Gotcha.
So when we see the same sequence of events over and over, like, say, a kid reaching for a flame and then getting burned,
Oh, yeah.
our minds, they start to connect those two things. We start to expect the pain will follow the reaching, even if we don't totally get, the science of why fire burns.
Right.
And that's how we learn to navigate a world full of cause and effect.
And so this reliance on custom and habit, like Beebee explains, it's really what allows us to function in this world that's, so saturated with these cause and effect relationships.
Right.
We don't need to have a PhD in chemistry to know that, sticking our hand in a fire is a bad idea. Our repeated observations, that's all we need for our causal beliefs.
And I think it's really important to remember here the distinction that Hume makes between two types of knowledge. He talks about relations of ideas and matters of fact. Relations of ideas are things like mathematical truths that are just demonstrably certain.
Right.
You can know them a priori just through reason.
Got it.
But matters of fact, they're different. Those are based on our observations of the world, and they can always be doubted because our experience is always changing.
So then causation, that falls under matters of fact.
Exactly right. We can't ever be absolutely positive that a specific cause will always lead to the same effect every time.
Okay.
All our causal inferences really rely on this thing that Hume calls the uniformity principle.
Okay.
It's the assumption that future events will resemble past events.
So basically, the future is going to look a lot like the past.
But Beebee, she points out this really clever thing.
What's that?
There's actually kind of a circularity to that logic.
Oh, how so?
Well, because the uniformity principle itself seems to be based on causal reasoning.
Oh, so it's like we're using causation to justify causation.
Hume's point is we can't just use pure a priori reasoning to justify the uniformity principle. It's not some self-evident truth, like a math equation. It's our own ingrained habits of causal inference that make us think the future will resemble the past. Our minds are just wired that way from a lifetime of observation.
So it's like our brains are kind of filling in the gaps, assuming that things will keep happening the way they always have.
And that brings us to Hume's two famous definitions of causation,
Okay.
which Beebee, she really unpacks in depth in her book. The first definition is all about what we observe externally. So it's about that constant conjunction.
Right.
When we see event A, always followed by event B.
This is just like that regularity?
Right. But then the second definition, it gets more into our internal experience.
Okay.
It's about that feeling of mental determination when we anticipate event B after seeing event A. And this second definition, I think it's really cool because it highlights the psychology of how we think about cause and effect.
Yeah, it's not just watching external events. It's about that internal feeling of anticipation.
Right. It's like a mental click as we move from cause to effect.
It sounds like what Hume's saying is this feeling of mental determination is what makes us believe there's some necessary connection between cause and effect, even though we can't actually see that connection out in the world.
You got it. That's one of Beebe's key insights. Hume argues that this feeling of necessity is actually something we project. We experience this mental leap from cause to effect, and then we kind of impose it onto the world as if it were some objective property of the things themselves.
So it's almost like we're imbuing the world with our own internal experience, like we're coloring it with our own feelings.
Hume has this great analogy with aesthetic judgments. You know how we project beauty onto a painting?
Yeah.
But that beauty might not be a real quality of the painting itself.
Right.
It's more about our own feelings and perceptions.
Okay, I see what you mean.
Well, Hume says it's the same with causation. We have this feeling of anticipation, and then we project this idea of a necessary connection onto the events we observe.
And this raises a really big question. If our sense of causation is a projection, in a way, then what does that mean for the limits of human knowledge?
Yeah.
Are we forever trapped inside our own subjective experiences and never able to grasp the true nature of causality itself?
And that's where things get even more complex, and it leads us into these two main interpretations of Hume's work, skeptical realism and projectivism.
And that's exactly where we'll pick up in the next part of our exploration, so stay with us. Welcome back. Before we jump into those two interpretations, I think it's worth remembering just how central this idea of custom and habit is to Hume's whole philosophy. Beebee really drives this point home in the book. It's not just about causation, it's about, the foundation of how we reason and form beliefs about everything.
Right. Beebee really lays it all out. You know how custom is at the root of practically all our knowledge, not just the stuff about cause and effect. She even points out how our basic assumptions about the world, things we totally take for granted, like the belief that the sun will rise again tomorrow, those are based on custom and habit, too, not some rock-solid logical principle.
You're saying even something as fundamental as our belief that things will continue to exist even when we're not looking at them, that's just based on habit.
Exactly. Hume's argument is we don't have this direct pipeline to how the universe actually works. All we've got are these impressions that come through our senses and the connections our minds make between them.
Right.
So we see the sunrise every morning, and over time, the force of habit just makes us expect it'll keep happening.
It's kind of a humbling thought when you realize how much of what we believe is just these ingrained habits of thought. These mental shortcuts our brains have developed to make sense of things.
It is, and it brings us back to those two big interpretations of Hume on causation, that Beebee presents skeptical realism and projectivism.
Right.
So skeptical realism, as she explains it, suggests that Hume actually does believe there's some real power underlying causal relationships, even though we can never really know what those powers are.
So it's like saying, yeah, okay, there's something that makes those billiard balls move when they collide, but we just can't wrap our heads around what that something actually is.
We can observe the constant conjunction, the regular patterns that make us form causal beliefs, but that ultimate nature of the causal force itself, it's hidden from us. Beebe's point is that skeptical realism recognizes the limits of our knowledge while still leaving open the possibility that there's a reality out there that works according to its own rules, whether we understand them or not.
So it's like a more humble approach to knowledge. We're not claiming to have figured everything out.
Right, and that fits in with Hume's general skepticism about reason. He's always reminding us that our understanding is limited by our experiences and the way our minds work.
Now, how does projectivism differ from that?
Projectivism takes things a step further. As Beebee explains, it suggests that Hume is basically agnostic about whether there really are real powers behind causation.
Okay.
Instead, it emphasizes how we create causal connections in our own minds through our habits of inference and that feeling of mental determination we talked about.
So projectivists would say that when we talk about causes, we're not describing some objective reality. We're really just talking about our own mental processes.
It's about recognizing that our experience and how our minds are wired shape how we perceive and think about causation. That doesn't necessarily mean denying that there's a reality out there independent of our minds, but it does shift the focus to the active role our minds play in building our understanding.
That interpretation seems to put more emphasis on the subjective side of how we know things, It's not just passively soaking up information. It's about actively shaping that information into patterns that make sense to us.
Yeah, and Beebe does a really good job of showing the strengths and weaknesses of both these interpretations. She points out that while skeptical realism might feel more intuitive at first, projectivism actually offers a simpler and more psychologically realistic explanation of how we actually form beliefs about causes.
So both have their merits. Skeptical realism reminds us we don't know everything, while projectivism highlights how active our minds are in shaping our understanding.
Yeah, and as Beebe shows, both interpretations can be supported by stuff Hume actually wrote, which makes it really hard to say definitively which one he really believed. I think the most important takeaway is that our understanding of causation, no matter how we interpret it, is tied up with how our minds work.
But if our sense of causation is so connected to our psychology, does that mean it's all just subjective?
Hmm.
Could we end up believing all sorts of crazy connections just because our minds are so good at finding patterns even where they don't exist?
That's a huge point, and Hume was definitely aware of that challenge. Beebe explains that while Hume stresses custom and habit in shaping our beliefs, he also gives us tools to tell the difference between real causal connections and just coincidence. He lays out these rules by which to judge of causes and effects that can help us make our causal reasoning more accurate. Beebe goes into a lot of detail about these rules, but basically they emphasize things like repeated observation, how consistently events happen together, and whether there are other factors that might be messing things up.
So it's not just a free-for-all of projection. We have to be careful and really test our assumptions against what we see in the world.
Beebe makes it clear that while Hume rejects that idea of having some innate insight into causes, he still thinks we can develop a reliable understanding of them through observation experiments and using our reason.
Which brings us to the question of what all this means for science. If our understanding of causation is rooted in custom and habit, how does that change the way we do scientific research?
And that's a question we're going to explore in the final part of our discussion, so stick around.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Hume's work on causation, as seen through Helen Beebee's book. We've been talking about those two main interpretations of his thought, skeptical realism and projectivism, and really how those impact how we think about knowledge. But now I want to dig into how those interpretations actually affect how we do science and our whole pursuit of knowledge in general.
That's a great question, and Beebe actually spends a lot of time in the book talking about how Hume's philosophy connects to the scientific method. So let's start with skeptical realism. If we go with that interpretation and say, okay, there are these real powers in the universe, but we'll never really know what they are,
Right.
that could sound kind of discouraging for science, right?
It does make you wonder what's the point of all these experiments and observations if we can't ever really get to the bottom of why things happen the way they do.
I get that, but Beebe's point is that skeptical realism doesn't make science useless. It just changes what we're aiming for. She says science isn't only about uncovering some absolute metaphysical truth about the universe.
Right.
It's also about making reliable models, coming up with good predictions, and understanding the patterns we see in the world.
So we're shifting from trying to be absolutely certain about things to going after practical knowledge that helps us function in the world.
Beebe uses atomic theory as an example. Like, we might not ever fully grasp the forces that hold atoms together, but we can still create models that explain how they behave and even use that knowledge to harness atomic power.
Right.
So skeptical realism says, okay, we have limits to what we can know, but that doesn't mean what we can achieve through science is worthless.
Like, we may never find that ultimate truth, but we can still build a solid understanding of the world that lets us live in it and do things.
Absolutely. Now let's think about projectivism. This one, Beebe explains, can seem a little more radical when we think about science.
Yeah.
Because if talking about causes is mostly about expressing our own mental processes and what we believe, it could make it seem like we're just imposing order on a world that's actually chaotic.
It almost sounds like we're just making up our own reality instead of discovering one that's already out there.
That's a common misunderstanding. Beebe's careful to say that projectivism doesn't deny that there are real patterns in the world. It just acknowledges that our understanding of those patterns is always going to be influenced by our minds, our experiences, and the way we think about things.
So it's not saying objective reality doesn't exist, but more that our minds are actively involved in building our knowledge through how we interact with the world.
Beebe argues that projectivism, instead of leading to this anything-goes view of science, actually makes rigorous methods critical thinking and constantly testing our models even more important.
Because even though our minds shape our understanding, those minds are constantly checking in with the world,
Yeah.
taking in feedback and changing our models as we get new information.
Right. She actually suggests that, in a way, projectivism makes science seem even more dynamic and engaging
Okay.
because it recognizes that our knowledge is always changing, always open to being revised as we learn more.
So it's like science is this ongoing conversation between our minds and the world. We're always going back and forth trying to get the clearest, most reliable picture of reality that we can.
That's a great way to put it. And both skeptical realism and projectivism, even though they have differences, really emphasize how important human perception and how our brains work are in shaping what we know about the world.
Yeah, whether we think there are these unknowable real powers or we focus on how our minds create causal connections, the key takeaway is that science is a human thing through and through. It's tied up with how our minds operate.
And Beebe really shows how Hume's ideas about causation, custom, and habit are still relevant today, especially in fields like cognitive science, psychology, even artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
All areas where understanding how humans reason is so important.
This has been a really thought-provoking look into Hume's work on causation through the lens of Beebe's book. And even though Hume doesn't give us simple answers, his ideas give us this powerful way to examine how we learn and wrestle with those limitations, but also the amazing potential of our own minds.
I agree. Like Beebe says in the end, Hume's most important contribution is this reminder that we need to approach this whole project of trying to understand the universe with both a sense of humility and this deep appreciation for the complex ways our minds work.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Hume on causation. We really encourage you to check out Beebe's book and keep thinking about these big questions about knowledge, causality, and the human mind.